The Duke of Ashworth returned to Hartwell House in the bruised gray light of an October afternoon. The carriage had rattled over the long drive without ceremony, the wheels crunching on wet gravel, the horses steaming in the cold. He had been in London for the better part of a year, managing the labyrinthine affairs of his estate, and more importantly, avoiding the one duty that had been forced upon him like a lead weight around his neck. He had been married by proxy 6 months ago, a business arrangement, a settlement of debts between his late father and a northern merchant who had risen too high on the tide of new money. The daughter, Eleanor, had arrived at Hartwell House 3 weeks prior, accompanied by a single trunk and a quiet maid. The household had not known what to make of her. She was not loud, nor vulgar, nor demanding. She was simply there, a shadow in the west wing, a presence that the servants spoke of with a mixture of pity and disdain. They had expected the bride of a duke to be either grand or pathetic. Eleanor was neither, and that made them suspicious. The Duke, Alexander Charles Percival, 6th Duke of Ashworth, had intended to stay in London until the end of the year. The marriage was an inconvenience, a legal necessity. He had not seen his wife. He did not wish to see her, but the letter from the Secretary of State had forced his hand. The Sardinian ambassador would be traveling through the county and required lodging for a night. The secretary had made it clear that such an honor was not to be declined. Hartwell House must be prepared. The Duke must be present, and by implication, the new Duchess must be presented. Alexander found this almost amusing. The thought of some provincial merchant's daughter, uneducated and unpolished, attempting to navigate the razor-thin social protocols of a diplomatic dinner, was a comedy of errors waiting to unfold. He had heard her father had made a fortune in shipping and had spent it on tutors for his only child, a futile attempt to graft refinement onto common stock. The result, he assumed, was a woman who could perhaps read a menu and curtsy without falling, but who would be hopelessly out of her depth among the titled and the powerful. He stepped down from the carriage and the front door swung open. A line of footmen stood at attention. The butler, a man named Croft, stepped forward with a bow. "Your Grace, welcome home." "Croft," Alexander's voice was a low, bored drawl, "is the house in order?" "Yes, Your Grace. The Duchess arrived 3 weeks ago. She has been settling into the Rose drawing-room." Alexander's mouth tightened. The Rose drawing-room was his mother's favorite. He did not like the idea of a stranger occupying it. Move her to the East sitting-room. Croft hesitated, a flicker of something in his old eyes. "The East sitting-room is rather cold, Your Grace. The chimney needs repair." "Then have it repaired." "I shall inform Her Grace." "Where is she now?" "She was walking in the gardens, I believe." Alexander nodded and strode into the house. He did not go to the gardens. He had no desire to meet his wife among the wet hedgerows and dying roses. He went to his study and spent the next 2 hours reading the accumulated correspondence, his mind already mapping out the elaborate choreography of the diplomatic dinner. He would seat Eleanor at the far end of the table, beside the oldest and most deaf of the local gentry. She could nod and smile and remain silent. No harm done. He was interrupted by a soft knock. A maid entered with a tray of tea. She was young, plain, and looked terrified. "Your Grace, I was told to bring this." "Set it there." He did not look up. The maid curtsied and backed toward the door. Then, as if summoning courage, she said, "The Duchess wished to know if Your Grace required anything further." Alexander looked up slowly, his eyes the pale gray of a winter sky fixed on the maid. "The Duchess may attend me here. I would speak with her." The maid curtsied again and fled. Alexander returned to his letters, but his concentration was broken. The thought of finally seeing this woman, this stranger who bore his name, stirred a faint, irritated curiosity. He had avoided it for 6 months. Now it was unavoidable. He heard the footsteps a few minutes later. Light, measured, unhurried. He did not rise. He kept his eyes on the paper before him. The door opened. A woman entered. Alexander saw a pair of worn leather shoes, the hem of a simple gray dress, a woolen shawl drawn across narrow shoulders. She was not tall, but she held herself with a straight-backed composure that seemed out of place in the opulent study. Her hair, a deep brown, was pulled back in a modest knot. Her face was oval, with high cheekbones and a mouth that held no hint of a smile. But it was her eyes that gave him pause. They were dark, steady, and remarkably unafraid. They looked at him as though she had seen him 1,000 times before, and had long ago ceased to be impressed. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was low, clear, with a faint northern lilt. Alexander tilted his head. "You must be Eleanor." "I am." He waited for her to curtsy. She did not. She simply stood there, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze level with his. The silence stretched. Alexander felt a flicker of annoyance. He was not used to being studied. "You have been at Hartwell House for 3 weeks," he said. "You have found everything to your liking." "The house is very beautiful," she said. "The gardens are overgrown, but the soil is good." He blinked. "The soil." "There is a south-facing slope near the lake that would do well for a winter garden. Beans, kale, perhaps late carrots. The kitchen garden is too shaded." Alexander stared at her. He had expected a nervous flutter, a stammer, an apology for existing. Instead, she was discussing soil composition. He felt a strange dislocation, as though the conversation had slipped sideways. "I did not bring you here to discuss horticulture," he said. "Then why did you bring me here?" she asked. The question was simple, direct, and unexpectedly sharp. It cut through the layers of formality and evasion. Alexander's jaw tightened. He wanted to say, "I did not bring you here. You were forced upon me. I would rather be in London. I would rather be anywhere but here." But he could not say these things. Not yet. He stood slowly, unfolding from his chair. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark superfine and polished boots. He moved to the window and looked out at the gray afternoon. "There will be a dinner," he said. "The Sardinian ambassador will be staying with us next week. You will be required to attend." "I understand." "You will be seated at the far end of the table. You will speak only when spoken to. You will not attempt to discuss politics or art or anything beyond the weather. Is that clear?" He turned to look at her. She was watching him with that same calm, level gaze. There was no flush of humiliation, no tremor of hurt. She simply nodded. "Very well," she said. Her compliance should have satisfied him. Instead, it irritated him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to protest, to argue, to show him the messy, common emotion he assumed lay beneath her quiet surface. But she gave him nothing. She moved toward the door, then paused. Her hand rested on the latch. She looked back at him over her shoulder. "The east sitting room is cold," she said. "I will not be moved there." Before he could respond, she was gone. Alexander stood alone in the study, the silence rushing back like water into a hollow. He felt an unfamiliar sensation, a prickling heat at the back of his neck. He had been dismissed, not with anger, not with tears, but with a quiet, final authority that left him feeling strangely off balance. He poured himself a glass of brandy and drank it in one swallow. The taste was bitter. The dinner, he thought, would be a disaster, but not for the reasons he had imagined. The days before the diplomatic dinner passed in a strained quiet. Eleanor remained in the Rose drawing-room, and the chimney in the east sitting-room remained unrepaired. Croft, the butler, had not raised the matter again, but Eleanor noticed that a footman had quietly delivered an extra supply of firewood to the Rose drawing-room, as if defying the Duke's unspoken wishes. She said nothing. The house was a labyrinth of cold corridors and colder glances. The servants watched her with a curiosity that bordered on predation. She heard them whisper in the hallways, their voices low but not low enough. They spoke of her plainness, her lack of jewels, her northern accent. They spoke of the Duke's indifference. They spoke of the upcoming dinner as a stage upon which the new Duchess would be revealed as a fraud. One evening, Eleanor stood in the shadow of the great staircase, and listened to two maids in the servants' hall, their voices carrying up through the servants' stair. "His Grace means to make a fool of her," one said, seating her at the far end with old Sir Prendergast, who cannot hear a word and who dribbles his soup. "Serves her right," the other replied. "A merchant's daughter who thinks she can be a duchess. She cannot even arrange a proper dinner party. I heard the housekeeper say she does not know the difference between a fish fork and a salad fork." Elinor felt the words land on her like cold rain. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago in the noisy household of her father that pride was a silent thing. It did not shout. It did not argue. It simply waited. She turned away from the staircase and walked to the library. It was the one room in Hartwell House where she felt a measure of peace. The old Duke, Alexander's father, had been a collector of books, though she suspected he had never read most of them. The shelves rose to the ceiling, crammed with leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and faded. The air smelled of dust and old paper and the faint, sweet scent of beeswax from the candles. Elinor had spent most of her 3 weeks in this room, working through the collection methodically. She had read the histories first, then the travelogues, then the poetry. She had found a first edition of Dante's Inferno in the original Italian, and she had been translating it slowly, savoring the music of the language. She was seated by the window, the book open in her lap, when she heard the door open behind her. She did not turn. She knew the sound of his footsteps, heavy, deliberate, the steps of a man who expected the world to move around him. "You are fond of the library," Alexander said. His voice was flat, but there was a note of something beneath it. Curiosity, perhaps, or annoyance. Elinor closed the book and looked up. The Duke stood just inside the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back. He was dressed for riding, his boots mudded, his coat thrown over one arm. His dark hair was wind-blown and his face was flushed from the cold. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been riding hard to avoid something. "It is a fine collection," she said. "You can read, then." It was not a question. It was a dismissal. He assumed she could not, or that she could only read simple things, a shopping list perhaps, or a child's primer. The contempt in his voice was so casual, so practiced, that it took Elinor a moment to register it. She held his gaze. "I can read," she said. He walked closer, his eyes on the book in her lap. "Dante," he said, reading the title, "in Italian, ambitious. I find it soothing." He smiled, a thin, humorless curve of his lips. "I imagine you would. The pictures are quite fine, I am told. Doré's engravings, but they are wasted on a woman who cannot understand the words." Elinor felt a small, sharp flicker of anger. It was not the insult itself that stung, it was the ease with which he delivered it. He did not know her. He had never asked. He had simply decided. She opened the book to a random page and began to read aloud, her voice low and steady. "Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. Mi ritrovi per una selva oscura. Che la dirida via era smarrita." The words filled the silent room like water filling a basin. Elinor's accent was flawless, the Italian rolling off her tongue with the liquid ease of a native speaker. She read 2 more lines, then stopped. She looked up at the Duke. His expression had shifted. The smug smile was gone. In its place was a blank, careful mask. "My father believed that a woman who could speak the languages of other nations would never be a prisoner of her own," Elinor said. "He was a merchant, but he was not a fool." She closed the book and stood. She was not tall, but in that moment she seemed to fill the space between them. "The dinner will be held in the great hall on Thursday," she said. "I will be ready. You need not worry that I will embarrass you." She walked past him and out of the library, leaving him standing alone among the dusty shelves. Alexander stood motionless for a long moment. He could still hear the echo of her voice, the perfect Italian syllables, the quiet authority. He felt a strange unease, as though he had reached for a stone and found his hand filled with water. She could read Italian, not just read it, speak it with the accent of a scholar. How had he not known this? How had no one told him? He thought of the servants' whispers, the assumptions he had absorbed without question. He thought of the seating plan, the carefully constructed humiliation. And for a moment, he felt the first cold touch of doubt. But he pushed it away. A few lines of poetry did not make a diplomat. The dinner would still be a trial and she would still fail. He would make certain of it. That night, Alina stood by her window, looking out at the dark expanse of the gardens. Her maid, Bess, sat by the fire, mending a torn hem. "They are saying terrible things below stairs," Bess said quietly. "About the dinner, about you." "I know. They say the Duke means to use you as a jest." Alina said nothing. Her reflection in the glass was pale and still. Bess hesitated, then set down her needle. "My lady, may I speak freely?" Alina turned. "You always do, Bess." Bess took a breath. "Your father did not send you here to be mocked. He sent you here because he believed the Duke would honor you. He believed the Ashworth name meant something. You have every right to show them who you are." Alina's gaze softened. "And who am I, Bess?" Bess met her eyes. "You are the daughter of a man who taught you to read 5 languages. You are the woman who negotiated a trade dispute in Genoa when she was 17. You are the one who knows the Sardinian ambassador because your father saved his career. You are not a jest. You are the only person in this house who has nothing to prove." Alina turned back to the window. The moon had risen, pale and distant over the dark line of the lake. "Then perhaps," she said, "it is time they learned." The night of the diplomatic dinner arrived like a blade drawn from a sheath. Hartwell House blazed with candlelight. Every window in the great hall was lit, every chandelier polished to a blinding shine. Carriages rolled up the long drive in a steady procession, depositing lords and ladies, baronets and baronesses, the lesser gentry of the county, and a few grand figures from London who had made the journey specifically to witness the new Duchess of Ashworth. The great hall had been transformed. Long tables stretched the length of the room, draped in white linen and set with silver so old it had turned the color of storm clouds. Flowers from the hothouses, roses, lilies, sprigs of rosemary, filled the air with a sweetness that bordered on cloying. Footmen in powdered wigs moved like ghosts between the guests, carrying trays of champagne and claret. Alexander stood near the head of the table, greeting his guests with practiced charm. He was dressed in black velvet and white silk, his dark hair brushed back, his pale gray eyes scanning the room with the cold precision of a general surveying a battlefield. He was waiting for Alina. She had not yet appeared. He had positioned the seating chart himself. Alina would be at the far end, beside Sir Prendergast, the deaf old knight, and Lady Bexley, a notorious gossip who would no doubt spend the entire evening probing for weakness. It was a carefully designed ambush, and he felt a flicker of grim satisfaction as he imagined Alina's discomfort. He was not prepared for her entrance. The doors at the top of the great staircase opened, and Alina descended. She wore a gown of deep green silk, simple in cut but so elegantly fitted that it moved with her like water. Her dark hair was swept up, revealing the long, graceful line of her neck. She wore no jewels except a single strand of pearls. Her mother, she had told him once, though he had not been listening. Her face was calm, her chin lifted, her dark eyes scanning the room with the quiet composure of a woman who had every right to be there. The room did not go silent, but it did pause. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. The new Duchess had arrived, and she was not what they had expected. Alexander felt something twist in his chest. It was not admiration. It was not attraction. It was something closer to unease. She looked like a duchess. More than that, she looked like a woman who knew exactly what she was walking into and had chosen to do so anyway. He moved to meet her at the bottom of the staircase. Her eyes found his, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Then she inclined her head. "Your Grace," she said. "You are late," he said. "I was reading." He almost smiled, almost. "The guests are waiting." Then we should not keep them. She placed her hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. He led her into the great hall, and the whispers grew louder. He heard fragments, rather plain, don't you think? And such a simple gown, and I heard she cannot even write her own name. He felt her hand tighten slightly on his arm, but she did not falter. At the table he seated her at the far end. She did not protest. She simply sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Sir Prendergast launched into a rambling story about his hunting dogs. Lady Bexley smiled with sharp, predatory warmth. "My dear Duchess," Lady Bexley said, leaning close, "how are you finding Hartwell House? It must be so overwhelming for someone of your background." Eleanor's smile was polite, cool. "The house is very beautiful. I have been exploring the library." "The library, how delightful. Do you enjoy reading?" "Very much." "And what sorts of books do you prefer? Novels, I suppose, something light." Before Eleanor could answer, the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the entire atmosphere shifted. A footman announced in a ringing voice, "His Excellency, the Ambassador of the Kingdom of Sardinia." The room rose. It was not a matter of choice. It was reflex. The ambassador was a man of considerable political weight, a favorite of the King of Sardinia and a trusted friend of the Prince Regent. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a coat of midnight blue with silver embroidery. He moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who had spent his life in the halls of power. Alexander stepped forward to greet him. "Your Excellency, welcome to Hartwell House." The ambassador shook his hand with absent courtesy, his eyes already scanning the room. "Your Grace, thank you for your hospitality. I have heard much of your estate. We are honored to have you." The ambassador's gaze continued to move, past the titled heads and glittering gowns until it stopped. He had found Eleanor. She was still seated at the far end of the table, watching the exchange with that same calm, level gaze. The ambassador's face changed. The polite smile vanished. In its place came a flash of something that looked like shock, then wonder. He turned to Alexander. "Your Grace, forgive me, but is that the Duchess of Ashworth?" Alexander frowned. "Yes, my wife." The ambassador did not wait for further explanation. He walked past Alexander, past the startled footman, past the rows of gaping guests. He moved directly to the far end of the table. Eleanor rose from her chair. The ambassador stopped before her. He looked at her for a long, breathless moment. Then, to the astonishment of every person in the room, he bowed, not the shallow bow of diplomatic courtesy, a deep, reverential bow, the kind reserved for royalty. And then he spoke. "La Signorina de Libri," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My dear lady, I did not think to see you again in this life." Silence that followed the ambassador's bow was so complete that Eleanor could hear the faint hiss of the candles in the chandeliers. Every eye in the great hall was fixed on her. Every fork was suspended. Every breath seemed held. She did not flinch. She did not look at Alexander. She looked only at the ambassador, and her expression softened into something warm and real. "Your Excellency," she said, "you honor me." The ambassador straightened, but he did not release her gaze. He took her hand and pressed it gently, his old eyes shining. "The honor is mine. When I heard you had married, I could not believe it. The daughter of my dearest friend married to an English duke, and yet here you are." He turned to the assembly, his voice rising with theatrical delight. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present to you a woman of singular distinction. This is Eleanor Maria Vespucci, the daughter of the late Giovanni Vespucci, the great Genoese merchant and diplomat, the man who saved my career, and I do not exaggerate my life, during the trade crisis of 1809. And his daughter, who at the age of 17 negotiated a settlement between the merchant houses of Genoa and the French Navy that every seasoned ambassador in Europe had failed to achieve for 2 years. The silence broke. A rustle of shock moved through the room like a wave. Whispered questions, half-formed exclamations, the scrape of a chair as someone turned too quickly. Alina felt the weight of 100 stares. She did not shrink. She lifted her chin and her voice was steady. "Your Excellency is too kind. My father always said the French Navy responded best to patience and a firm price list." The ambassador laughed, a rich, booming sound that filled the hall. He switched to Italian, the words flowing from him like music. "E tu, mia cara, hai dimenticato la tua lingua?" he asked. "And you, my dear, have you forgotten your language?" Alina answered in the same tongue, her accent flawless. "Non dimentico mai cio chi mio padre mi ha insegnato." I never forget what my father taught me. The ambassador beamed. He turned to the Duke, who had followed him down the length of the table, his face a mask of tight control. "Your Grace, you are the luckiest man in England," the ambassador declared, clapping Alexander on the shoulder. "You have married a woman of formidable intellect and diplomatic skill. I would trust her to negotiate with Napoleon himself. In fact, I once did." More gasps from the guests. Lady Bexley looked as though she had swallowed a live eel. Sir Prendergast, who had been dozing, woke with a snort and asked if the soup was coming. Alexander's jaw was so tight it looked carved from stone. "I was not aware of my wife's previous activities," he said, each word measured. The ambassador's eyes widened. "Not aware? But surely you knew of her father's work, of her own role in the Genoese negotiations. The Duke of Ashworth, a man of letters and learning, married to the daughter of Giovanni Vespucci, and he did not know." The question hung in the air like a drawn sword. Alexander's face betrayed nothing, but Alina saw the flicker in his eyes, a mix of humiliation, shock, and something else. Something that looked like guilt. "I did not know," Alexander said quietly. The ambassador studied him for a long moment. Then he looked back at Alina, and his expression softened. "Then you have a great deal to discover, Your Grace," he said, "and I envy you the journey." He offered Alina his arm. "Come, my dear, you must sit with me. I have been dreaming of good Italian conversation for weeks. These Englishmen are fine at fox hunting, but their idea of intellectual debate is arguing over the color of a horse." Alina hesitated. She glanced at Alexander. His face was unreadable. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She took the ambassador's arm and he led her to the head of the table. The other guests scrambled to make room. A footman rushed to place a chair beside the ambassador. Alina sat, and the ambassador began to speak to her in rapid Italian, his face animated, his hands moving. She responded with equal ease, laughing at one of his stories, asking after his family, inquiring about the political situation in Turin. Alexander returned to his own seat at the head of the table. He did not taste the food. He did not hear the conversations around him. He watched Alina, and he saw her as if for the first time, not as the plain, inconvenient bride, but as a woman of wit and power, a woman who could command the respect of a man who had dined with kings. The dinner passed in a blur. Afterward, in the drawing room, the ambassador requested Alina's company in a quiet corner, where they spoke in low voices for nearly an hour. The other guests watched from a distance, their whispers growing louder, their glances sharper. Alexander stood by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was approached by Lord Pemberton, a tall, handsome man with a reputation for charm and limited morals. Pemberton had been one of the few guests who had not whispered about Alina. Instead, he had watched her with a frank, appreciative interest that Alexander found suddenly infuriating. "Your Grace," Pemberton said, his voice smooth, "I must congratulate you. Your wife is extraordinary. I have never seen the ambassador so animated. He speaks of her as though she were a goddess." "She is well educated," Alexander said flatly. "That is rather an understatement. She speaks 5 languages, negotiates trade disputes, and charms the most powerful diplomat in Europe. And she does it all with a humility that makes the rest of us look like peacocks." Pemberton smiled, but his eyes were sharp. "It makes one wonder why you have kept her hidden away. A man who cannot see the value of his own wife deserves to lose her." Alexander's hand tightened on his glass. He wanted to say something cutting, but the words would not come. Pemberton was right. He had hidden her. He had assumed she was worthless, and now the entire world was seeing the truth. He looked across the room at Alina. She was laughing at something the ambassador said, her eyes bright, her face alive. She looked beautiful. She had always been beautiful, he realized. He had simply refused to see it. Lord Pemberton moved toward Alina, and Alexander felt a cold, sharp twist of jealousy. He had no claim to her attention. He had done nothing to earn it, but she was his wife, and suddenly that mattered. He crossed the room, his steps deliberate. He reached Alina just as Lord Pemberton was bowing over her hand. "Your Grace," Pemberton said to Alina, "I hope you will allow me to call on you tomorrow. I have a collection of Italian poetry at my estate, and I would be honored to hear your opinion on a particularly difficult passage." Alina smiled politely. "That is very kind, my lord." "My wife will be occupied tomorrow," Alexander said, his voice cold. "She has responsibilities at Hartwell House." Pemberton's smile did not waver. "Then perhaps another time." He bowed and moved away. Alina looked at Alexander, her expression unreadable. "That was unnecessary," she said quietly. "You are my wife. I will not have you making appointments with known fortune hunters." "He is not a fortune hunter. He is the only person in this house who has spoken to me as an equal." The words stung. Alexander opened his mouth to reply, but the ambassador approached, his face beaming. "Ah, there you are, Your Grace. I was just telling the Duchess that I must leave early tomorrow, but I hope to see you both in London before the end of the season. We shall have a dinner at the embassy. The Duchess will be the guest of honor." He bowed to Alina, kissed her hand, and departed. The room began to empty. Carriages were called. Goodbyes were exchanged. Alina stood by the window, watching the lights of the departing carriages fade into the darkness. Alexander approached her. He did not speak for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," he said at last. Alina turned to look at him. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were not. "Yes," she said, "you do." She walked past him, leaving him alone in the fading light. The morning after the diplomatic dinner, Alexander rose before dawn. He had slept poorly, his dreams a jumble of green silk and Italian poetry and the ambassador's amused, knowing eyes. He dressed without calling for his valet and went down to the breakfast room, hoping the cool morning air would clear his head. The room was empty. A fire crackled in the grate, and the sideboard was laid with silver dishes. He helped himself to coffee and stood by the window, watching the mist rise from the lake. He heard footsteps. Alina entered. She wore the same simple gray dress she had worn on the day they first met, her hair pulled back, her face pale but composed. She did not look at him as she moved to the sideboard and poured herself a cup of tea. Alexander turned. "You are up early." "I have always been an early riser." "We need to talk." She sat at the table, her cup in her hands. "Then talk." The calm finality of her tone made him hesitate. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind a dozen times during the night. He had planned to demand an explanation for her deception, to accuse her of making a fool of him, to reassert his authority as her husband. But sitting across from her, watching her sip her tea with that quiet, patient dignity, the words felt hollow. "You should have told me," he said. Alina set down her cup. "Told you what exactly? That I could read, that I spoke Italian, that my father was a diplomat as well as a merchant. You never asked. You arrived at Hartwell House and assumed I was a fool. You seated me at the far end of the table so I would not embarrass you. You told me to speak only of the weather. You treated me as a problem to be managed, not a person to be known." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet anger that had been building for weeks. "I know," he said, "I was wrong." The admission hung in the air. Eleanor did not soften. She did not rush to accept his apology. "Wrong," she repeated. "You called me a jest. You wanted me to fail. You would have enjoyed my humiliation." "That is not true." "Is it not? You planned the seating. You placed me beside Sir Prendergast and Lady Bexley. You knew exactly what they would say to me. You knew they would mock me, and you did it anyway." Alexander felt the weight of her words. She was right. He had done all of it. He had been cruel in a way that was all the more damning because it had been so casual, so thoughtless. "I did not know you," he said. "I assumed. I let the servants' gossip shape my opinion. I let my own pride blind me. It is no excuse, but it is the truth." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Her dark eyes searched his face, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see through him, down to the smallest, meanest parts of his soul. "You are right," she said. "It is no excuse." She stood. "I am going for a walk. We can continue this later if you wish." "Eleanor." But she was already gone. Alexander stood in the empty breakfast room, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade. He felt something he had not felt in a very long time: shame. It was a cold, sour weight in his stomach. He had spent his life believing himself superior, blood, by education, by sheer force of will. And in one evening, a woman he had dismissed as unworthy had shown him how small he truly was. He wandered through the house, unable to settle. In the library, he found the Dante still on the table where Eleanor had left it. He picked it up and opened it to the page she had read aloud. He could not read Italian. The words were meaningless shapes. He had mocked her for not understanding, and yet it was he who was ignorant. He set the book down and went outside. The morning was cold, the grass wet with dew. He walked toward the lake, his mind churning. He wanted to find her. He wanted to apologize again, to make her understand that he was not the man she thought he was, or at least, he did not want to be that man anymore. He rounded a bend in the path and stopped. Eleanor stood by the water's edge, her back to him, and she was not alone. Lord Pemberton stood beside her, his head inclined toward hers, his expression earnest and warm. They were speaking in low voices, and Eleanor was smiling, a real smile, not the polite mask she wore for Alexander. She laughed at something Pemberton said, and the sound carried across the still water like a bell. Alexander felt a cold, sharp twist in his chest. It was jealousy, raw and ugly. He had no right to feel it. He had done nothing to earn her laughter, her warmth. But the sight of another man receiving what he had so carelessly thrown away cut him to the bone. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. Eleanor looked up. Her smile faded. "Your Grace," she said. Pemberton turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Ashworth, a fine morning." "Indeed." Alexander's voice was clipped. "I did not expect to find you here, Pemberton. I thought you were staying at the inn in the village." "I decided to take the morning air. The grounds are beautiful." "They are, but they are private." Pemberton's smile did not waver. "Of course, I was just leaving." He turned to Eleanor and bowed. "Duchess, I hope we may continue our conversation another time." Eleanor inclined her head. "Thank you, my lord." Pemberton walked away, disappearing along the path. Alexander turned to Eleanor. She met his gaze without flinching. "You had no right to speak to him that way," she said. "He has no business walking alone with my wife." "I am your wife in name only. You have made that abundantly clear." The words hit him like a blow. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. She was right. He had married her by proxy and ignored her for 6 months. He had treated her as an inconvenience, a burden, a source of embarrassment. He had no claim to her loyalty. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, "I know I have no right to ask this, but I need to know. Why did you agree to marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment. The wind stirred the water, sending ripples across the glassy surface. "My father died with debts," she said quietly. "The marriage contract with your family paid them. I did not agree to marry you because I wanted a title or a grand house. I did it because it was the only way to protect my father's legacy. I came to Hartwell House hoping that you might be the man my father believed you were, an honorable man, a man of intellect and integrity." She paused. "I was wrong." She walked past him back toward the house. Alexander stood alone by the lake, the cold wind cutting through his coat. He watched her go, and for the first time in his life he felt the full, crushing weight of his own failure. He did not follow her. He did not call out. He simply stood there alone, as the mist rose from the water and the morning grew pale. For 3 days, Alina and Alexander moved through Hartwell House like ghosts in a shared dream, their paths crossing only in the most perfunctory ways. They ate at opposite ends of the long dining table, exchanged stiff pleasantries in the hallways, and retreated to their separate quarters. The servants noticed the tension, and the whispers began again, this time with a sharper edge. The Duke and Duchess had fallen out. The marriage was a farce. She would be sent away before Christmas. Alina ignored them. She spent her days in the library, reading and writing letters. She wrote to the ambassador, thanking him for his kindness. She wrote to her father's old business partners in Genoa, inquiring about the estate and the remaining debts. She wrote to a solicitor in London, asking about the legal requirements for a separation of property. The last letter she did not send. She folded it and tucked it into the back of a book, unsure of her own resolve. Alexander, meanwhile, retreated to his study. He could not stop thinking about Alina, her quiet dignity, her sharp intelligence, the way she had looked at him by the lake. He had spent his life building walls around himself, and she had walked through them without effort. He wanted to apologize again, to explain himself, but every time he approached her, the words died in his throat. On the third day, he found the letters. He was searching for a document in the old steward's desk, a piece of estate business that needed his signature. The desk was a massive, ugly thing of dark oak, crammed with ledgers and correspondence. As he rifled through the drawers, his hand brushed against a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. He pulled it out and untied the knot. The letters were addressed to the late Duke of Ashworth, his father, in a neat, flowing hand. The signature at the bottom of each was the same, Giovanni Vespucci. Alexander's hands were not steady as he unfolded the first letter. He read slowly, his heart pounding. "My dear Duke, I write to you with a father's hope and a merchant's caution. My daughter, Alina, is my greatest treasure and my most dangerous secret. She speaks 5 languages, negotiates with men twice her age, and carries herself with a dignity that would shame many of the titled ladies I have met. I have kept her education hidden from the world, for I feared that a woman of such accomplishments would be seen as a threat rather than a blessing. When you proposed the union between our houses, I hesitated. I did not wish to sell my daughter, but you assured me that your son was a man of honor, a man of learning, a man who would value her mind as much as her inheritance. I believed you. I still believe you. Teach her, love her, and she will be your greatest ally. Your friend, Giovanni." Alexander read the letter twice, then a third time. His hands were shaking. He thought of his father, a cold, distant man who had never once spoken to him of the marriage except as a financial transaction. The old Duke had known Alina's secret. He had known that she was extraordinary, and he had said nothing. Alexander found a second letter, dated a year later after his father's death. It was addressed to him. "Alexander, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you have married Alina. I know you do not understand why I arranged this union. I know you see it as a burden, but I beg you to look beyond your pride. She is not what she seems. Her father protected her from the world, and I promised him that you would protect her too. Do not fail her. She is the only chance this family has to be worthy of its name. Your father." Alexander set the letters down on the desk. His eyes burned. He had failed. He had failed her father, failed his own father, failed Alina. He had been given a treasure and had treated it as a nuisance. He sat in the dusty study for a long time, staring at the faded ink. Then he took a sheet of paper and wrote a single line. "Will you dine with me tonight, not as a duchess, as a leaner?" He folded the note and called for a footman. That evening, Alina stood in her room, the note in her hand. She had read it a dozen times. The handwriting was elegant, the words simple, but she knew what they meant. It was not an invitation to dinner. It was an invitation to a new beginning. Bess helped her dress, a simple gown of soft blue, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who was tired of hiding, tired of waiting. "What will you say to him?" Bess asked. Alina considered the question. "I will listen," she said, "and then I will decide." She went down the stairs and found him in the small dining room, the private one, not the great hall. The table was set for two, with candles and a modest supper. Alexander stood by the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she entered, and for a moment he simply looked at her. "Thank you for coming," he said. Alina nodded. She took her seat and he sat across from her. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. It was the silence of two people standing on the edge of something vast. He did not touch his food. He looked at her and his eyes were raw. "I found the letters," he said. Alina's brow furrowed. "What letters?" "From your father to mine. He wrote of you, of your education, your gifts. He told my father to protect you, to honor your mind. My father wrote back. He promised." Alina's eyes widened. She had not known. Her father had never told her. "My father died before I could know any of this," Alexander continued. "I married you out of duty and then I ignored you out of pride. I assumed you were beneath me. I was a fool." Alina said nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap, her face pale. Alexander leaned forward. "I am not asking for your forgiveness tonight. I do not deserve it, but I am asking for a chance. To learn. To become the man your father believed I was. To earn your trust." Alina studied him. She saw the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability in his eyes. He was not the arrogant Duke of Ashworth anymore. He was a man stripped of his illusions, and he was terrified. "Trust is not given," she said quietly. "It is built, day by day, hour by hour, and it can be broken with a single careless word." "I know. Do you?" He did not flinch. "I am willing to find out." Alina looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. His skin was warm, his grip uncertain. "Then we begin," she said. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Hartwell House had ever witnessed. The Duke and Duchess began to take their meals together, not in the grand hall but in the small dining room, where the candlelight was soft and the conversation was easy. They walked the grounds every afternoon, through the bare winter gardens and along the frozen edge of the lake. They spent hours in the library, Alexander sitting with a volume of Italian grammar, while Alina read aloud from Dante, translating the cantos with patient precision. The servants whispered, but the whispers had changed. They spoke of the Duke's transformation, of the way he listened to his wife, of the way he laughed, actually laughed, at something she said. They spoke of the cold drawing room that had been repaired and filled with flowers. They spoke of the new footman who had been hired because the Duchess had suggested it, and the Duke had agreed without argument. Alina did not soften easily. She challenged him, corrected him, pushed him to be better. But she also saw the genuine effort, the humility, the way he struggled to unlearn a lifetime of arrogance. She began to believe that change was possible. In December, the ambassador returned to England. He sent a letter to Hartwell House, announcing his intention to visit for the Christmas season. The entire household was thrown into a flurry of preparation. But this time, Alina was not relegated to the shadows. Alexander consulted her on every detail, the menu, the guest list, the seating arrangements. He introduced her to the cook as the Duchess, and he said it with pride. The night of the ambassador's arrival, Alina stood before the mirror, dressed in a gown of deep wine silk. Bess fastened a string of pearls around her neck. "You look beautiful," Bess said. Elinor smiled. "I feel like myself." The great hall was lit with 100 candles. The guests had arrived, the same lords and ladies who had whispered about Elinor at the diplomatic dinner. They watched her now with different eyes. They had heard the stories. They knew who she was. The ambassador entered, his silver hair gleaming, his face bright with anticipation. He crossed the room and bowed to Elinor, just as he had before. "La Signorina de Libri," he said, "you are more radiant than ever." Elinor laughed. "Your Excellency, you are too kind." This time it was Alexander who stepped forward. He extended his hand to the ambassador, but his eyes were on Elinor. "Allow me to present my wife," he said, "the Duchess of Ashworth, my equal in every way." The ambassador looked from one to the other, and his face broke into a wide, genuine smile. He shook Alexander's hand warmly. "It seems you have learned what I already knew," he said. "You are a fortunate man." "I am," Alexander said. He turned to Elinor and offered her his arm. She took it, and together they led the ambassador into the great hall. The dinner was a triumph. Elinor sat at the head of the table beside Alexander, and she held court with the grace of a woman born to it. She spoke in Italian with the ambassador, in French with a visiting diplomat, in German with a Prussian baron. She debated trade policy with Lord Pemberton, who had been seated several places away, and who watched her with a mixture of admiration and regret. She told stories of Genoa, of her father, of the negotiations that had made her name. The guests listened, spellbound. Alexander watched her with a quiet, unguarded pride. He did not interrupt. He did not compete. He simply sat beside her, his eyes bright, his heart full. After dinner, the guests moved to the drawing room. The ambassador approached Alexander and Elinor, his expression serious. "I have a confession," he said. "When I first heard of your marriage, I was worried. I knew Elinor's father. I knew what he had hoped for her. I feared that an English duke would crush her spirit." Elinor looked at Alexander. He met her gaze. "And now?" Alexander asked. The ambassador smiled. "Now I see that her spirit has not only survived, it has transformed you. That is a rare thing." Alexander turned to Elinor. In the soft light of the drawing room, she looked calm and radiant, her dark eyes bright with unspoken understanding. "I was a fool," he said, "but she taught me that fools can learn." Elinor smiled. "You were never a fool, you were just afraid." "Afraid. Afraid of being seen, of being known. We are the same in that way." Alexander reached for her hand. The ambassador discreetly turned away, joining another conversation. "Are we?" Alexander asked, his voice low. Elinor looked at him. "I came here expecting to be invisible. You saw me, even when you did not want to. That is why I was so angry. You made me hope. And now—" She squeezed his hand. "Now I am no longer invisible, and neither are you." He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of you, not because I must, but because I want to." Elinor's eyes glistened. She did not look away. "Then do not prove," she said. "Just be, that is enough." The fire crackled in the grate. The conversation swirled around them. Somewhere in the room, a footman dropped a glass, and there was a ripple of laughter. But for Alexander and Elinor, the world had narrowed to a single point of light. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it softly. She did not pull away. In that moment, surrounded by the glittering machinery of society, they found something that none of the titles or fortunes or grand estates could provide: a quiet, unshakable promise. The ambassador returned to his conversation, but not before glancing over his shoulder at the Duke and Duchess. He smiled to himself, a secret, knowing smile. Giovanni Vespucci had been right. His daughter was extraordinary, and the Duke of Ashworth, for all his flaws, had finally learned to see it. The Christmas season passed in a blur of dinners and dances and long walks in the snow. Alexander and Alina became inseparable. The household settled into a new rhythm, warmer and brighter than before. The servants stopped whispering. There was nothing left to whisper about. On New Year's Eve, Alexander led Alina to the library. The room was dark except for a single candle on the table. He closed the door behind them. "I have something for you," he said. He handed her a small, leather-bound book. She opened it. The pages were blank. "It is for you to write your own story," he said. "Not the one your father wrote for you, not the one I tried to write for you. Yours." Alina looked at him, and her eyes were full. "I do not know what to write," she said. "Then we will write it together." She smiled, together. It was not a question, it was a promise. She closed the book and set it aside. Then she reached up and touched his face, her fingers light against his jaw. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me." He pulled her close, and in the quiet of the library, surrounded by the dust of ancient books and the warmth of a single candle, he kissed her. Not the kiss of a duke claiming his duchess, but the kiss of a man who had finally found his equal. And when they drew apart, the future stretched before them like an unwritten page, full of light and possibility. The Duke of Ashworth had invited his uneducated wife to dinner as a joke, but it was he who had been taught the greatest lesson of all, that true nobility is not a title. It is the courage to love what you once feared and to be transformed by it.